Hello and welcome to Lamplighter. We are on day number 18 of our quest to read through the Bible in 2021. I'm glad that you've joined me today for our discussion of today's reading. Today's reading takes us into what is for many people very familiar territory. This is the segment of the Old Testament that I have always loved. I love the story of Joseph. I have to be very careful when I get to this segment of the text in my daily reading because the story is so familiar to me. I remember as a child growing up in the church, and I remember the stories being told, this being always one of my favorites. I read this in my Bible today and I start to think, oh, I know this one. I could tell this one myself, and I have to be very careful or I miss the message that's truly pertinent here. You see, my mind immediately kicks into gear and I say, I know this one. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, as we saw in our earlier reading, and today's reading picks up where Joseph goes from there. The Ishmaelite or Midianite traders to whom Joseph's brothers sold him have now traveled down to Egypt, and they have sold Joseph as a slave to Potiphar, the captain of the king's guard in Egypt. Potiphar is very pleased with Joseph. Joseph has great success in his household. Potiphar puts him in charge of his entire household. Meanwhile, Potiphar's wife makes advances toward Joseph. Joseph is fearful of her advances. He says no to her and runs away, leaving his coat in her hands. She, with the coat in her hands, is embarrassed and humiliated, and so she fashions a story that Joseph tried to make advances against her. She relates that to her husband Potiphar. Potiphar, in his anger, puts Joseph in prison. While Joseph is in prison, he meets a butler and a baker of Pharaoh, who have also been cast into prison when they made Pharaoh angry. These two men each have a dream. Joseph interprets their dreams, and the dream interpretations come true. The butler is restored to his position as Joseph had predicted, and the baker is killed as Joseph had predicted. 2 years pass when Pharaoh has a dream, and none of his magicians or wise men in the country can tell him what the dreams mean. And finally, the butler remembers his promise to Joseph to tell Pharaoh about him. He mentions to Pharaoh that there's someone in prison that had interpreted his dream successfully. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph, tells Joseph his dream. Joseph interprets it, and he tells Pharaoh that there are going to be 7 years of plenty in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine, and that someone needs to be appointed in order to take care of and store away some of the grain during the years of plenty, so there'll be food to eat during the famine. Pharaoh is impressed. He puts Joseph in charge of the whole land, and that's the end of the story as we read it today. But here's the problem. You see, when I think like that, I think I already know it, and I don't read it as carefully as I should. Now, you know that I'm always saying, let's read the story with this in mind. The main character is not Pharaoh, nor is it the butler or baker in prison. The main character is not Potiphar or his wife. The main character is not even Joseph. The story, as always, is about God. And if you read it that way, some amazing things pop out, especially in today's reading. Now, I have gone through and I have circled every time the word Lord in all capital letters or God appears in today's reading. And I just want to share some of these markings with you to show you how the story truly is about God. If you'd like to follow along in your Bible, I'm going to be reading on page 78. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. The Lord was with him, and the Lord gave him success in everything he did. We read on down a little further. From the time Potiphar put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, notice this, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, why is that? He sees that Joseph is blessed by God. When Potiphar's wife makes advances to Joseph and he refuses, a little bit further down on the same page. Joseph answers her, "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns is entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife." Now notice this. I love Joseph's sense of consciousness here. He says, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Now, you might expect Joseph, when he makes this speech, to say, "How could I do this thing and sin against Potiphar, as good as he's been to me?" But that's not what he says. He says, "How could I do this thing and sin against God?" So as she makes advances toward him, he runs away, leaving his cloak in her hands. Joseph is later put in prison, and we read on page 79, "While Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care." Does this sound familiar? Because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Why was Joseph so successful in Potiphar's household? Because God was with him. Even Potiphar saw that. Why was Joseph so blessed even while he was in prison? Why was he treated so kindly by the prison warden? It's because God was with him and continued to bless him, and the warden recognizes that. Then when the butler and the baker have their dreams, they say to Joseph, explaining their discouragement, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph says to them, he doesn't say, "I can interpret your dreams." He says, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So they each tell him their dreams, and Joseph, with the help of God, certainly, is able to interpret those dreams. Now, Pharaoh later calls for Joseph to interpret his dream, and notice what Pharaoh says to Joseph. "I had a dream," this is on page 80, "I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you, Joseph, that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph doesn't get big-headed about that. He simply replies to Pharaoh, "I cannot do it." But God will give the answer to Pharaoh that he deserves. We read on, and when Joseph interprets the dream, he says, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do." He says, "It's just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what is about to happen." And on. God has already decided what's going to happen. God has already forecast that there's going to be 7 years of plenty. God has already forecast that there's going to be 7 years of famine. And God has already made it clear that Egypt needs to be wise in their collection of and their distribution of food. And all of this plays into the beautiful story that continues to unfold of God's plan. We'll see as we continue to read that it's the famine in the land that ultimately brings Jacob, or as we now know him, Israel and his family, to Egypt to live. They are the Israelites. That's how they get to Egypt. That's where their many years of slavery will begin. And it's all connected in a part of God's marvelous story, God's marvelous plan. Now, I know we've gone a little bit longer today than usual, but I felt compelled to make sure that we're seeing that this is a big, big story that we get to be a part of. That's why it's so exciting to be a lamplighter. His word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. I'm so glad you've joined me today, and I hope you have a blessed day.